Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to the second webinar of the CGIAR's Climate Impact Platforms webinar series. Through this series, we have been attempting to bring to our CGIAR scientists, but also for the external audience, topics that are of relatively recent origin for research when it comes to research on climate change and in the agri-food space. Our first series of topics has been around loss and damage. Loss and damage happens when either climate mitigation or climate adaptation is not sufficient to prevent the actual physical losses and damages happening in this sector. So for us at the CGIR, we have not traditionally worked on loss and damage. So this is the second webinar in the series. In the webinar one, we had looked at the scientific basis of loss and damage, particularly around the attribution science of it. In our second webinar series, we are going to look at the policy dimension of it, including the negotiations that are going on at the UNFCCC, from both the perspective of how the historic evolution of that particular negotiation, but also the role of both the civil society as well as the UN and other bodies in progressing in making breakthroughs in this particular negotiation track. Of particular interest to our CGIR researchers and to researchers everywhere, given that it is a relatively new topic for research particularly, is what is it that we can do that helps in bringing this agenda forward, and what can we do to make sure that the loss and damage fund that has been constituted is adequately financed through some of the research initiatives. So with that, I have great pleasure in introducing today's program and today's speakers. So we have two excellent speakers today who are two both very familiar faces at all the COP negotiations on these topics. So we have Dr. Animesh Kumar, who is the head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and he has been working in the space of um, uh, disaster risk reduction, including in various capacities. So we would be pasting his CV, his bio in the chat. So I'm not reading out all of it. So Dr. Animesh will bring forward the views from those negotiations. We have also Teresa Anderson. She's the global lead on climate justice at ActionAid International. And Teresa has been very active from the civil society and from the activism side. And she will tell us about the progress, the slow and painful progress, maybe, of the loss and damage negotiations and the future. So before we go into this, I have two announcements. One is just a very briefly the rules of engagement. If I can just go to that slide. So we would please introduce yourself in the chat. Please use the Q&A. Don't use the chat. Actually, use the Q&A to ask your questions. And all throughout the session today, our speakers will answer those questions. Whatever remains unanswered would be answered towards the end. And then do stay on mute and engage in Q&A, etc. And now I would quickly go through today's agenda. After this brief introduction and a Slido poll that will come up shortly, we would have two presentations, one by Dr. Animesh, who will be looking at the diverse perspectives on loss and damage, and how to avert, minimize, and address them, followed by another presentation by Teresa Anderson, and she will talk about the role of civil society, followed by a Q&A. With that, if I might, we want to begin this with a Slido poll and ask our audience a question. If we can share the screen of the Slido, we have in the chat the details about how to. Yes, so join us at slido.com. Either you can scan the QR code or you can join us at www.slido.com. The code is 2068835. the question we are posing to all our audience today: what research questions can the CGIAR ask in the loss and damage space? So all throughout the webinar, as you listen to our two esteemed speakers, please keep putting your ideas together, because that will really help us inform our own portfolio around this very important issue. So this poll will remain active till the end of this webinar. So with that, I now want to move on to our first speaker, Dr. Animesh. So Animesh, the floor is yours. And we are particularly, as I mentioned, interested in how can the CGIAR help in advancing the agenda, given the work that you have been doing in this space on behalf of the UNDRR. Over to you, and we are very excited to have you. 15 minutes.
Thanks, Dr. Aditi. It's always a pleasure being here and being among such familiar faces. And best greetings from Bonn. As of now, we are seeing 4 seasons in a single day in Bonn. So it's all good. I just wanted to, what I would do in my presentation is basically provide an overview of what are different approaches to loss and damage. And of course, from my organization's point of view, we'll approach it more from the disaster risk reduction angle, but also make a strong case that we really need to move forward in a synergistic fashion and not perpetuate the silos that we tend to create with our own work. And why is it important to work in coherence? I would also then talk about a few recent developments in the field of loss and damage, which are actually the result of years of effort. And then finally, I would end with, to make these work with the recent developments in loss and damage, what are the key mechanisms and enablers that we definitely would want to have in place, which are also pointers to some of the research questions that CGIAR might want to look into, or also in context of other audience, and might also become the basis for some further discussion. So starting with the conceptual point of view, we all know loss and damage issue has been there in the forefront for quite many years now. There is no formal definition for loss and damage in the UNFCCC processes, but countries 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, did acknowledge what loss and damage constitutes, anything which cannot be reduced by adaptation. So the limits of adaptation is breached and hence loss and damage happens. This is how it has been seen. This is also how the first governance approach to loss and damage was followed more than 10 years ago with the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism. Having said that, we also would want to acknowledge that loss and damage in different domains of work are also not new. For example, the first post-disaster needs assessment, or the disaster loss and damage assessment, was done more than 50 years ago. And since then, hundreds of PDNAs have been conducted. How it is defined in the context of loss and damage assessment is in terms of stock and flow. Stock in terms of damage and flow in terms of losses. So this is how it has also been seen in some other worlds. Making it more concrete, taking it forward, when 2015, when we had the Sendai framework, there were 7 targets that were adopted. Of these, target C and D actually talks about reducing losses and damages. It actually took a few steps forward and identified key indicators through which countries can actually report in terms of their actual losses and can actually report in terms of the infrastructure and critical infrastructure damages and disruption. As of now, more than 150 countries are currently reporting on Sendai Framework Monitor, and we have massive amount of data for these kind of features. We also have another form of data as well, but I'll come to that in after a few slides. But basically, the point here is that there are some conceptual coherent common basis in terms of bringing together diverse communities who have approached disaster risk reduction and loss and damage from their own angles. And hence the point has come where we are as of now to talk about coherent approaches. To make it more practical, what are the actions that are taken? So for example, this is a result in our own analysis of a survey that was conducted in 2021 when the Santiago network was being initially conceived, and member states were asked in terms of what are the key demands in terms of technical assistance for loss and damage. So what you see is a kind of mapping of different kinds of capacity gaps that the countries had asserted in terms of what do the need for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And you will see risk assessment, infrastructure resilience, early warning, early recovery as some of the key elements of loss and damage for which capacity gaps were identified. Now, we did then look into the different levels of capacity gaps that we had identified during the Hyogo framework for action and subsequently during the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And we found that similar examples also were found in Sendai framework as well, which basically means that while we may talk about conceptually different things, when it comes to the real action to be taken to take action against loss and damage, we're talking about common approaches towards building upon what actually exists, and hence not perpetuate further silos. Taking it forward again in terms of the disaster risk financing approach, we often talk about risk management strategies based upon the different frequencies and severity of hazards or climatic impact. And based on that, we try to understand which kind of risks we can avert, which kind of risks we would want to absorb, which kinds of risk we would want to retain, and which kinds of risk we would want to transfer. And this gives us a layered financing approach wherein we would want to understand that not every financing would be required at every level, but we need different levels of financing at different levels of action. And only when we do a proper, thorough risk assessment and understand what our risks are, only then we can be able to take the right action based on the kind of risks which are present at a specific context. This is something which we have actually deep dived into as part of a joint work we did with ODI and submitted to the Transitional Committee as part of loss and damage financing, where we proposed a framework for both extreme events as well as slow onset events to make a case that how disaster risk reduction financing approaches can become a good basis to inform the loss and damage funding arrangements. So having said that, basically the point I'm trying to make so far is that we're talking about things which may have grown up, which may have matured over time in different contexts, but we are converging in our thinking, and time has come to take the convergent action. So most recently, for example, the facility on technical assistance, the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, was launched a few years ago. And last year at Dubai, we as UNDRR together with UNOPS were selected to jointly host the Secretariat. Now, the governance arrangement of Santiago Network is based on an advisory board that provides the oversight and guidance to the functioning of the Santiago Network. There is a secretariat that we will be hosting, or we are hosting, and there is a network of organizations, bodies, networks, and experts who will provide services. Now, this is a very key opportunity for us in particular in UNDRR, that it forms a key opportunity to better align the efforts we are ongoing, being the custodian of the Sendai framework on the one side and the host of the Santiago Network on the other, gives a very strong rationale for moving forward towards coherent approaches. So what will be the business model of Santiago Network? Basically, a country, a developing vulnerable country, can approach the Santiago Network Secretariat requesting for technical assistance. The Secretariat will then reach out to a body or a network of service providers who are now institutionalized as OBNEs, asking them to provide services to the developing country and providing them funding if they need so to do so. Many of such technical assistance needs will be addressed through this process, and then the Secretariat will report back to the board, who then together with the WIMEXCOM reports back to the highest governing mechanism, the COP and the CMA. So that's a business model in which the technical assistance needs of developing countries is thought to be, is planned to be addressed. Now, the Loss and Damage Fund, when established, which was the +2 day of Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, 22, was a victory for all of us in the sense that years of efforts that have been put forward by developing countries, by the civil society, and many of us has really come to fruition. And I'm sure Teresa will talk more about it. At COP28, the governing instruments were adopted to determine the key elements with the establishment of a board, an interim secretariat, which will be coming to fore very soon, and the World Bank most likely to host the fund for an interim period of 4 years. Now, the fund will provide support for both economic and non-economic losses, and it will have the scope wide enough to take care of many of the seen and experienced losses and damages that we have seen as of now. It's very clear from if you look into the details of the COP28 decisions that many of the financing approaches that the loss and damage fund will provide will complement existing funding mechanisms, including what is found within the humanitarian side, as well as in terms of recovery and disaster risk reduction. So how do the two mechanisms come together? One is that the secretariats of the two mechanisms, the Santiago Network and the Loss and Damage Fund, will closely coordinate with each other, ensuring that the technical assistance of the Santiago Network complements the programmatic approaches of the fund and the funding arrangements. What exactly it looks like, it is yet to be seen. We just had the first board meeting of the Santiago Network in March. The board meeting of the fund is due end of this month. And hence, once these governing processes are concluded, time will come to practically approach it and how the two mechanisms can work together. But the vision is that one would provide more on the technical and soft side of support to the countries, and the other may provide funding in terms of the structural and programmatic approaches. It's also provided that the advisory board will nominate members to sit in the high-level dialogues of the funding arrangements, and the countries can then utilize such technical assistance through the Santiago Network to access funding from a wide range of resources, the Loss and Damage Fund being one of them. So these are very exciting times in the sense that we have been talking about loss and damage as a problem so far. We're talking about how the solutions would look like. Are these the real solutions? Perhaps yes, but only time will say. But what can we do as of now in terms of ensuring that we make these the real value addition points in terms of making things work? So a couple of things that I would want to highlight. As we move forward and loss and damage has transitioned from being just an issue of an emotive issue from a political side to become a real issue from the technical angle, what we need as of now is to know how much we are losing. If we don't know how much we're losing, we can't quantify our losses. We can't quantify our losses. We can't monetize it. We can't monetize our losses. We will not be able to avail the facilities which are currently present. And hence, what we need as of now is a huge investment in the kind of data to tell us, build up the evidence base for countries to understand their losses. What we have been doing over the last 30 years is establishing a nationally owned system called as Inventar. 112 countries as of now have established it so far and using it. And the beauty of this system is that it goes down to the local scales, to sub-district level in some cases, to understand what kind of impacts that disasters are happening. We are actually upscaling it as of now to include slow onset events and non-economic losses as well through a new system that we plan to finalize by end of this year and launch early next year. There are also other opportunities. For example, the data standards. We have just classified 302 hazards to better standardize the processes of collecting the data. The ongoing process in terms of the global goal and adaptation will also result in a number of indicators which will further strengthen the matrix, which are so important in the context of loss and damage. We just had a very good workshop in Bonn on transformative adaptation. And in a few weeks from now, many of us will meet in Bhutan for the UAE Belém work program, the second workshop, to understand how to move it forward in terms of developing the indicators. So some good work ongoing in the context of adaptation and disaster risk reduction, both in terms of developing the data standards and matrix, but as well as providing the evidence base is something which is the real investment need as of now. The other side is in terms of the policy. As of now, what we are seeing is that there are 2/3 of the countries in the world that have a disaster risk reduction plan, 129 in total. There are only 54 countries in the world that have a national adaptation plan. Now, the global goal and adaptation talks about transitioning from the current 54 to all the countries in the world having an app by end of this decade. If so be the case, we cannot start from the scratch. We need to build upon the existing 129 countries that already have a DRR plan. And for those countries that have neither, perhaps it makes sense to co-create these new plans rather than starting from the scratch. So the basic genesis for this whole thing is to have and build upon this understanding that risk reduction will not occur without having climate information in place adaptation will not be successful if it doesn't integrate risk reduction. And if both of them don't work in harmony, loss and damage will continue to happen. With this view, we have a very noble initiative called the Comprehensive Risk Management in line with Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, wherein we provide risk as a common denominator for countries to take action through coherent approaches and integrated planning. We have launched last year a leadership program at the subsidiary body meetings in Bonn. It has become hugely popular, and the link would be there, where you will see that more than 6,500 people actually have taken this course, and I encourage many of you to take that course as well, as is the case with a suite of different technical tools as well, which are at your service. We also would want to take a step forward in terms of extending comprehensive risk management to different sectors. We have identified agriculture and food systems, environment and health as some of the priority sectors, because the real action of coherence will happen at the level of implementation, which is the case of the sectors. So we had made a commitment at the Food System Summit in 2021 to have a comprehensive risk management for food systems. We are now part of the Climate Resilient Food System Alliance. CGIAR is also a member there. And we have jointly resolved to come forward with an issue brief very soon in terms of capitalizing on the issues that we are talking about and harmonizing them together in the form of a knowledge piece. We have just launched a policy brief on nature-based solutions through comprehensive risk management and are in the process very soon with a toolkit on ensuring that CRM is a good basis for environment sector. And we are in the process of doing the same with WHO on health. So you will see that a lot of effort is going on in terms of ensuring that we move forward towards coherent approaches, data and policy coherence being the key parameters of what we do moving forward. So with that, I would end my presentation and we'll go back to Q&A to answer some of them. Back to you, Aditi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar. I think that was a great, for those of us who are new to the topic. That was, I think, a great webinar, a great presentation to familiarize with some of those. And while I'm aware that we would do the question answers later, but some of the questions that came to my mind, and you can hold on to them, we would answer them, you can answer them later, was around the issue of how the Sendai network as well as the loss and damage fund, how would they coordinate? I think you said that that is yet to be decided. We were also interested in knowing a bit more about the technical assistance. What kind of requests can the countries make? We also work with a lot of developing countries here. So we were curious to know what kind of technical assistance requests can be made through this facility. And there are a few more. I would come to those in a while. So overall, what I took away from this is that a huge progress has happened, and now is actually the time to implement some of those decisions, including my takeaway on research was to quantify some of those losses and damages, including in the agri-food sector. So that was excellent. With that, I think I would encourage all our audience to put your questions in Q&A. And we would spend the last 15 minutes at least answering those questions and answers. So thank you, Dr. Animesh. We will be back soon and have the opportunity to answer. So now I want to go to our next speaker, Teresa, and to you, the ask is again, tell us about the story of how the civil society pulled off what seemed impossible even 2 years ago. So walk us through that, and keep in mind that we are very interested in doing research that helps the agenda. So over to you, Teresa.
Thank you so much. Very exciting to be here with you and to be taking this very timely opportunity to be talking about these questions just as the Loss and Damage Fund is on the brink of becoming operational. So theoretically, you're coming in at just the right time, so it's really exciting. So I mean, I'll start talking from a civil society perspective, and you'll feel it coming through. As civil society, as ActionAid, we really talk about climate justice. We don't only talk about climate change. And we really have a justice emphasis, because those most affected by climate change have done the least to cause the problem, and they are the ones that have the least capacity to address it. Meanwhile, as we all know, it's the wealthiest polluting countries that have the most historical responsibility over decades or even centuries for causing, the warming atmosphere that we're all suffering from today, and that also have the most capacity to take action and provide finance. So this is the fundamental injustice of climate change, and that is why ActionAid and civil society organizations, many of us talk about climate justice. We use the term of equity, of common but differentiated responsibilities between countries. And we always put climate finance and different countries' responsibility to do their fair share, as well as the need for solutions to put social justice at their core. To bring out some definitions, I don't know if this came out in the last webinar, but just to understand, losses are, the reason we talk about losses and damages, they are slightly different. Losses are when things are irreversibly lost and can't be recovered. So if you lose your income, or you lose your food security, or loss of land from rising sea levels. But damages are when things can be damaged, but they have a cost to repair, like your boat or your home or your roads. Economic loss and damage is when you can attribute a cost to the loss of income or the cost of rebuilding homes. But non-economic loss and damage is really an area where very critical, important things to people, but aren't usually associated with economic benefits. So religious or sacred sites, community support systems, social networks, mental health, all of these can be lost through, trauma when disasters happen, and are really, really valuable, but hard to put a number to. And then we also, of course, deal with both rapid onset disasters as well as slow onset disasters, the kind of events that are happening slowly, not in the news, and are often more damaging because often take a lot longer for people to realize is even happening, and often don't get the policy response and intervention that is needed. And I'm sure, that maybe those of you working on agriculture know this very well, but the kind of impacts are anything from cyclones and typhoons and hurricanes and floods, as well as droughts and wildfires and heat waves, hailstorms, wind damage, rising sea levels, glacial lake outburst floods, desertification, salination. And of course, erratic weather patterns is something that you rarely hear people who aren't into farming talk about. But those of you that are into agriculture know very well how difficult it is for farmers to choose when to plant, or when to harvest, or when to prepare their land, when they don't know when the rains are coming. And this is not something that I find people outside of the agriculture world really talk about. But it is, we all know, I think, in this community how challenging it makes farming, and how really this does affect yields and farmers' livelihoods. So who is most farmed? It's mostly the countries and communities who've done little to cause the climate crisis. And this is why, as ActionAid, we bring out this justice story when it comes to loss and damage. It is developing countries mostly, but not only, the small island states and least developed countries and African nations. I'm half Filipina, and I know very well that even though the Philippines doesn't fit into any of those it's a developing country, but it's not a small island state. But we've been severely battered over and over again, several times a year, by typhoons causing loss and damage. And of course, economies that are heavily dependent on agriculture are also getting disproportionately affected by climate change. The most vulnerable 20 countries that come under a group of V20, they did an analysis that shows that climate impacts have reduced their wealth by 20% over the last 20 years, so very substantial. And our analysis shows that climate impacts actually, they exacerbate existing inequalities, of course, but they also really cast a long shadow, because public, the extra costs, the loss of income, that leads to austerity, that leads to cuts in public services, and that also just leads to deeper poverty, which, lack of education, lack of healthcare, lack of care support can cast a long shadow and keep people living in poverty for generations sometimes. And so that is why people living in poverty, marginalized communities, are particularly affected. Youth who are extremely worried about their future, and who will be, in not too long, will be themselves raising families in a climate affected world, but don't know what their livelihoods can be, are of course very worried about what this means. And women and girls are disproportionately affected as well by climate impacts. 80% of people displaced by climate disasters are women. Women and children are 14 times as likely to die from disasters. And of course, as I'm sure you know, half or more of the agricultural workforce in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa are women as well. And yet, even though women are responsible for putting food on the table, they face all these additional burdens of having to fetch water and walk much further when the wells dry up. They have to fetch further for firewood. They're the ones putting food on the table for food production. They're the ones, doing childcare, facing exhaustion. And yet when climate disasters happen, they're also experiencing, they're the first to skip meals. They experience gender-based violence. Girls are the first to be pulled out of school earlier than their brothers when family incomes are affected, putting them on a more unequal path for life. And then all of the barriers that women face as well. Many countries don't grant women access to land. Women have been traditionally having less access to education and literacy, including because of climate change. They often extension services don't even provide those services to women farmers. In some countries, they only provide them to men farmers. Women who have low literacy levels don't necessarily have access to information about, how do they find out about what the weather is going to be if they can't read or don't have mobile phones? And also the confidence to sell your farm products in markets can be affected, by being a woman. Often women don't have access to finance in order to make more investments into their land, to make their land more resilient. And women are often in many spaces, excluded from decision-making spaces. So their experiences are thought of as less important than the elite men of the village who often make decisions without really listening to those who are suffering most. Now, I know this is teeny, so you can't really read this, but this is to give you a sense of how, the very long shadow that is cast by loss and damage because of the ongoing impacts of not only the immediate disaster, the loss of livelihoods and infrastructure, the deepening debt, but also the loss of public services, the non-economic loss and damage, the loss of tax revenue that then leads to more austerity, the nation's lack of economic activity, the costs of recovery and rebuilding, the costs of relocation sometimes if land has disappeared under the waves, costs of national debt repayment. So all of these add up and really, really disproportionately affect absolutely the countries that have done least to cause climate change. And when it comes to food systems specifically, I'm sure you're aware how much the rains affect with their late rains, short rains, false rains, too much rains, temperatures affecting crops, pollination, as you know that pollinators are now starting to emerge before or after the crops pollinate. So that's affecting yields more and more, as well as soils and livestock being affected. And so all of these mean, that there's crop losses, livestock losses, reduced fish catch, loss of income, loss of livelihoods, migration, and an increased feminization of agriculture. Often it's the men that leave the families behind to find work elsewhere. Don't always send money back, so the woman has to carry the burden alone to feed the family. Deepening debt, poverty, spiraling poverty, and increasing vulnerability to exploitation. And as we saw just, in the last couple of years, but absolutely devastating events, loss and damage events, devastating people's lives and their ongoing ability to produce food because of floodings and droughts in Pakistan, Malawi, Mozambique, and the Horn of Africa, really putting their setting their agricultural economic ambitions and communities' abilities to feed themselves significantly back. These are the kinds of activities that, you know, that we can do to become more resilient in food systems. And I think it's really important to remember that there's both a hardware, like a technology, and a software of adaptation. So it's also about, it's not just about investments and infrastructure, but it's also about people's capacity and skills and empowerment to prepare for and respond. And it's often that software, that people power, that is undervalued and under talked about, and yet is so critical. And now we'll talk about loss and damage in the UNFCCC, moving from the real world into the policy space. This little pathway is just a bit of a hint of the struggle that we've had, starting from 2007, when the IPCC AR4 did recognize that, you know, adaptation and mitigation probably won't get us to fixing it all, and there probably will be some impacts, you know, that we can't mitigate or adapt for. And so that meant that the small island states started to then push in the UN process, which until then only really recognized mitigation and to a small extent adaptation. The AOSIS countries, small island states, started to push for a mechanism to address loss and damage. A couple of years later, more countries joined the fight. Civil society has come out really strongly on this as well. And it's been, you know, I've been at each of these sessions along the way, and it is absolutely incremental. You know, in 2012, they decided finally to establish a loss and damage mechanism, but not with any funding, more of a sort of space where we can think about how to address loss and damage, but, you know, keeping the funding space aside. And then in 2015, loss and damage was recognized as a pillar of the Paris Agreement. That was also a big win, but the US really didn't want to be held to account for, you know, causing climate change, its responsibility as the world's biggest historical polluter. And so they absolutely put in some specific texts that said, basically, you can talk about loss and damage, but this does not mean that we have any liability or responsibility to provide compensation. We had a significant move forward in 2019 when the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage was established. That was, again, as Avinash described, it's to provide technical advice and to, you know, we have a wealth of experts across the world who can advise each other and give really on the ground useful support in that sense to countries suffering loss and damage. But again, it doesn't itself provide the funds. But finally at COP27, after, you know, a year of campaigning, and people were kind enough to give civil society organizations a lot of credit, because we were out in the streets, we were doing social media, we were on, you know, outside the conference rooms with die-ins, with banners, with actions, all sorts, and, you know, working with the media to get the media to tell that story every day throughout those COPs. And finally, that helped get the breakthrough that we needed for the outcome that we wanted. And so the Loss and Damage Fund is established, but it's not operational yet. There's still meetings going on this year to decide the governance, and we want to make sure that it is really responsive, rapid, and effective. One of the things we're really disappointed about is just even the meetings that are happening now this year are only allowing two civil society or two representatives per civil society constituency into those board meetings, which really means that process is A, less transparent, and B, the board members will not be able to hear from expertise like yours, like ours, as much as they need to in order to develop a fit for purpose fund. So we're really pushing them on that, because we want to make sure that this delivers on things like direct access funding for communities. We need to learn the lesson from the Green Climate Fund, which has been quite bureaucratic and hasn't been able to set up a window that really delivers for local communities in a speedy, effective manner. And of course, there's going to be all those questions about who contributes the funding, how much, We know there's a fight coming about, some will even try to claim that loan-based funding can be loss and damage, but civil society is absolutely adamant that loans just put climate vulnerable countries deeper into debt, and can often lead those countries themselves to be forced to export more fossil fuels and harmful industrial agriculture commodities that worsen the climate crisis, worsen local rights, and then it's a perverse framing of climate finance. So there's a lot still to fight for, including, there's a lot of controversies about the World Bank's role. It needs to do a lot of work to actually even meet the conditions required. And so we'll see if it manages to do that. We can talk more in the Q&A about perhaps areas of, where looking ahead of the role of science in contributing to the loss and damage conversation. But for sure, there's work to be done, as Avinash alluded to, that supporting countries and communities to do the assessment, to get the evidence and tools so that they can assess how much harm has been done and how much they need to ask for from the Loss and Damage Fund. And then, of course, as also alluded, there's technical knowledge for countries and communities to recover, help them recover and rebuild in the aftermath of disasters and slow onset events. And then there's also, the Warsaw International Mechanism is also a UNFCCC process with various task forces discussing different dimensions of loss and damage. And there, there's efforts to learn lessons, shape policy so that we can strengthen countries' and communities' abilities to cope with loss and damage. So with that, I'm happy to talk more and answer any specific questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Teresa, and thank you for making our audience acquainted with the long journey towards actually having a loss and damage fund, though there are very many steps still needed to actually operationalize those. So we still have good 20 minutes of time, and I wanted to start off the Q&A session. So if we can just put the spotlight on the speakers, if that's possible. Vanessa, please. We have few questions, and I can see, sorry, on all the speakers, on all the three. Yeah. Some of the questions are there in the Q&A, and thank you, Animesh. I see you have answered some of them, but I'm going to read out some of those. For one, what kinds of technical assistance can the countries expect? And also, how are the Sendai Network and Loss and Damage Fund likely to work together? I do understand that it's not all clear yet, but Animesh, if you can tell us a bit more about the expectations from these two bodies working concurrently, the soft versus the hard cash part of it.
Thanks, Aditi. I think you mean the Santiago Network and the loss and damage.
Yes, sorry, Santiago Network, yes.
Yeah, good. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of, it's, of course, it's yet to be seen because there is no scoping as such in terms of the work that can be done. It has been kept as flexible as possible. But what we know for sure is that the genesis of the Santiago Network is based on the recognition of the lack of capacities of the countries to be able to do things on their own. And then once they have understood, taken some initial steps, that will perhaps open the window and doors for bigger pots of funding. So it points to a great extent to the level of absorptive capacities that developing countries often face in terms of accessing big pots of money. So basically through the Santiago Network will be the building block, I would say that, in terms of, or if I may also use the term readiness, for a country to be better prepared in terms of accessing bigger parts of funding. And the scale of funding is also a kind of testimony to the kind of funding we're talking about. For example, if I just look at the pledges, the Santiago Network has received a pledge of $40.7 million. The Loss and Damage Fund has received more than $660 million. So that also goes on to show the scale we are talking about. Perhaps the Santiago Network, for a very practical example, hypothetically, would provide a country the technical assistance to conduct their own loss and damage assessment. And the results of the assessment would need to be implemented, and funding for that could come from the loss and damage fund. So that's kind of scenarios one can look for. What kind of technical assistance can a country or an individual or any community expect from Santiago Network? It's very flexible. And there was a reason why it was kept so flexible, because everything is so context specific. So the loss and damage needs will differ community by community and in the same community over time. So there is no scoping or there is no parameters that have been offered, but I may offer 2 points of information. One, all the governments in the world have been invited to assign or determine their liaison person who would be the focal point to submit requests, although that part of submission is also kept very flexible. And the second is that as per the COP decision, the Secretariat is required to develop the guidelines in terms of what will be the operational modality of accessing technical assistance and how will the OBNEs or the service providers be designated to provide the services. So we are in the process of actually drafting those guidelines, and once approved by the advisory board, we should be able to talk more concretely.
Okay, thanks. No, this was also concrete enough, that understanding between the difference between the two and the quantum of finance that comes through was a very important clarification. To Teresa, the question is, will non-economic losses, are they also a part of the funding mechanism? And also the question is, how does one differentiate between the funding that goes for loss and damage versus adaptation? People are saying is going to be the same pot, while the money that goes for adaptation is going to be siphoned away. So any thoughts or views on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, non-economic loss and damage is a type of loss and damage that isn't necessarily thought of as an economic piece, but of course, money is needed in order to address the losses of those non-economic pieces, if you like. For example, if people have suffered greatly, the loss of the loss of community social networks, for example, means that you have more reliance on services. Then there needs to be, that's something that can be accounted for, that was delivered for free by your community earlier. But if you want to really address that loss, that trauma, that support system, then you need to find ways using finance to put those social support systems back in place, usually with social services, for example. Or social protection schemes. So that is why you can address non-economic loss and damage with finance, and but it's admittedly not an area that is fully articulated or attributed or understood. So indeed, that is something that I would say could be flagged as an area for further research, to try to understand what are the best ways to address non-economic loss and damage, and then how can you put a cost to the support required to do that. So you could, if you lose your land and communities need to move to other areas, how do you rebuild them in a way that they can still be, strong, confident communities? That all needs thinking about. And of course, farming communities in particular. Then your second question on
adaptation versus loss and damage. And to that, if I can just add, was question from my colleague Tim Thomas. He's also asking which part, loss and damage like the attribution part of it. How do we know that it's caused by climate change? And our last month's webinar was exactly on the attribution side. So I also wanted to have your perspective on whether that's adding anything to the debate. Should the loss and damage be limited to when we know that the loss and damage was due to anthropogenic climate change, or does that muddy the water too much?
I would say there are certainly there are many examples when it's very clearly an adaptation intervention and very clearly a loss and damage intervention in the aftermath of a disaster. But there could be cases where one could argue that that an intervention might apply as either an adaptation intervention or a loss and damage intervention. For example, it could be both before and after a disaster. It could be after a disaster and preparing for a future disaster, that you're building your resilience, but doing so in a resilient way to try to reduce your vulnerability to future disasters. So I don't think it's appropriate for those that hold the pot, those that hold the purse strings, to say no, that's a adaptation funding, that's not loss and damage, or no, that's loss and damage fund, that's not adaptation. The fact is there is not enough money for either. And if there is money going to address any of that, to be honest, I don't care which pot it comes from. And I don't think we should get tangled up in knots when there is so little money available for either. If there is money coming through that can help people, then we should be happy with that. If we get to the point where we've got so much money coming out of our ears from all the different pots and we have to choose, and that there's a risk of double funding, well, then let's cross that bridge when we come to it. But we're nowhere there, unfortunately. And so the question of attributing it to climate change, I think there is a lot of science out there now with the attribution issue, but I think climate disasters are happening and people need to be helped. To be honest, there is so little funding out there. People aren't getting double funding for humanitarian response and for the same thing for loss and damage as well. So I just think we should be channeling money to the people that need it.
Right. No, that's a very important point, that there isn't that lot of money that's getting duplicated anyway. That brings me to one question that I think very much up your alley, Animesh, and that's about how do we deal with difference between loss and damage finance and DRR finance. I remember our conversations that there is a lot of commonality between them. So what can we learn from the experience of DRR funding that can help with the loss and damage funding? Keeping in mind, again, the pot of money that's available for these public disposals aren't huge. It's not as if we lack money overall, but these funding pots are very, very limited nonetheless.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point, and I completely agree that we should stop talking about complementarity between funding approaches, because it often doesn't help. What we need is a more organic approach to solving common problems, and the problems are shared. So it doesn't make sense that we understand that there is a common problem, but then we try to bring together funding from different sources, and then get it and implement it through different ministries and departments. I can just give an example. Let's say early warning systems. Early warning is considered to be an adaptation action, as well as a disaster risk reduction action, as well as a loss and damage minimizing action. The focal point for these, the same action, are different in the same country. One is the National Disaster Management Office and one through the Ministries of Environment. The funding parts of the two from the international sites are often different. Now we're trying to secure funding for the same activity in the same country from different funding parts and being implemented by different ministries in the same community. I think it's a total recipe for chaos. I think this is what we need to resolve by moving forward towards having common approaches, common plan, integrated plan where possible. The Pacific countries are a classical example where 13 or 14 of them have already developed an integrated plan. And I would encourage all of you to go to the NAP Central and pick up the plans of Tonga and Kiribati, and you will see that they have actually submitted the DRR plan as their NAP. So it goes on to show that there is a growing reception of integrated approaches. And it also becomes very important from the sense that both climate and DRR financing are woefully inadequate. As of now, like more than $200 to $366 billion per year is the financing gap for adaptation. Disaster risk reduction international financing is only 4% of the humanitarian budget. So if both the funding parts are so low, we can only make ourselves worse by fragmenting them further. So the common point being that let's adopt risk or comprehensive risk management approaches to developing common plans and implement it in a joint fashion so that we don't have to distinguish between different funding pots and make best use of what we have.
Right, right. No, that's great. And again, coming to the funding pots being inadequate today, I was in another seminar by the OPEC Fund for Development, and I heard this news. Well, it was news for me. Perhaps many people know it, that while the annual requirement for adaptation, in according to one report, was say 360 billion in the agri-food sector. Just in the first quarter, we consumers have collectively bought roughly $360 billion of Apple merchandise. And that shocked me to the core, So that's what we are talking about. It's not as if isn't, money in the global system. It's just those prioritizations. So I thought that was a
The
shocking.
world eats more than $100 billion worth of ice cream each year. And we weren't even able to make that in our climate finance target.
Okay, that's even more. Yeah, and to imagine. So we have a few more questions and we have 5 minutes. I would encourage both the panelists, so whenever they have a minute, to keep answering those. We have two around the Santiago network, whether financing is available for research for improving adaptation. We have a question around that, perhaps for animation. We have a question around damage in the mountainous regions. So I don't know, either of you can take that question. Then we have the third one around whether we would be if there is an opportunity for including tracking indicators for loss and damage within the IPCC enhanced transparency framework. Okay, that's a new one. Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Let me give a try and pass over to Teresa thereafter. So one is in terms of whether Santiago network as a mechanism can be used or for technical assistance. Yes, I mean, sky is the limit till the point it can be justified to fall within the brackets of loss and damage. And what is very important for us to understand is that while the loss and damage fund and funding arrangements focus on responding to loss and damage, more on addressing side, the Santiago network is much more open and talks about averting, minimizing, as well as addressing. So we're also talking about adaptation action in that context of averting. So yeah, I mean, there's high flexibility in what kinds of technical assistance can be availed. On the point on the indicators for transparency framework, it's not very clear to me, but what I can say that there's so many indicators that are being developed. We, as of now, for example, have in the last 8 years, have been implementing the Sendai framework indicators, for example, with 38 of them, 150 countries reporting. Several of them, 24 of them, are the same as the SDG indicators. This is something which is very much applicable in the context of global goal on adaptation, which we're currently doing. And I believe the same will be the case with the enhanced transparency framework as well. What is important to understand that all our actions should be balanced by loss and damage. We may say we're doing everything right, but the right things may not happen. And this is a big lesson we have learned in the field of disaster risk reduction, where everyone said during Hugo framework that we're doing perfect, it's a perfect world. But at the same time, the disaster impacts doubled during the same time. So it's very important that whatever we do, the actions or the cost of inaction should be measured against the increase or decrease in loss and damage. There was one more very interesting question that I would want to pick up on in terms of where should the conversation start at the national level? And there's so many focal points for each. And I think, yes, I mean, there is the UNFCCC formal focal point, but as we are moving forward towards these many mechanisms, it's very important to ensure national coordination. There are many countries that actually have an SDG platform or a national platform where multiple ministries come together. And as we move forward, it is very important at the national level and then subsequently at the local level, we avail these coordination mechanisms to then come out with a much more coherent response from the governments themselves. Otherwise, it will not work very well. And that's a big risk that we're moving towards as these many mechanisms come to the fore.
Right. Teresa, if you can just take a short minute to answer some of these, whatever has remained unanswered, and I would like to show the Slido poll a little bit.
Yes, I think it's good to see
part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, the question about, the research, and I think we can look to Animesh on the Santiago Network funding structures and how that can support. And I think it's a good question to, because the science needs to be there. The scientists have a role to play in helping countries and communities track the real and the longer term impacts on agriculture and farmers' livelihoods, not just the immediate aftermath, humanitarian response aftermath, but this longer shadow is not quite as well tracked or evidenced. And I think there's a research gap there. And also how to develop interventions, the agronomic and social economic interventions that can help loss and damage recovery. I think that is not so much talked about as, recovery, loss and damage, and the agronomic piece there. I think that is a very interesting area of research as well. As ActionAid, we really see the benefits of women's empowerment, participatory methodologies, agroecology. And so I think from an ActionAid perspective, I would be interested to see more research that works towards getting these recognized as relevant solutions to people's lives, as well as to research and policy. And then I think there's a big question as well about, loss and damage is beyond the humanitarian piece. As I said, it's also about how to rehabilitate lands and food systems post-disaster or even in the face of slow onset events. So I think there's lots of interesting gaps. So thank you for raising the questions.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And those are indeed some of the topics that we do work on. We have an initiative on agroecology, and we do have a lot of work around agronomic practices, genetic innovations, and so on, everything that helps build resilience for farmers. But we are increasingly understanding that many of those initiatives are not enough by themselves, and the role of social safety nets. And also feel that some of
Very
the
much.
funds can be actually used for those kind of social safety nets. So with that, we are at the dot of the hour. I think we are 1 minute ahead because it was a fantastic. I learned a lot personally, and I'm sure our audience also learned new things today. And it has also sparked new interest in this area. And perhaps we can do work together going forward, both with ActionAid as well as with UNDRR. I'm personally looking forward to it. And just briefly, our next month's webinar would be around carbon credits and carbon offsets, and the fact that land is often seen as the solution for many of these initiatives, and whether they work or not is something that we will try to learn in our next webinar. So I will keep you all posted, and thank you so much.
You can invite me to that one. I have strong views.
Yes. Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Animesh, and lovely to see you all. Bye.
Thanks.